So I'm going to do a bullets presentation on study 1, which is also called we know it informally as the language study. It's actually about the cross-cultural semantics of words related to the 3 concepts that we've been investigating in the project. And the study was originally designed by under the leadership of Laila San Roque, and then it got delayed a little bit for a number of reasons. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of results to present here, but I do hope that some of the work in progress that we're currently carrying out will give you a little bit of an insight and of an idea of what we're doing, and also hopefully what will come out of it at the end. So the study goals are, it was designed anyways to be exploratory, to identify the key terms of all the languages that we're working with, for possible translations of the 3 English concepts and related concepts, understanding the canonical use of the key terms in each of these languages, and then elicit explicit lexical knowledge of the participants about these key terms. So you'll see that we also have, aside from knowledge, wisdom, understanding, we do have thought and belief added in order to expand the range of possible answers that we get. So how did we do that? The methods are, so first we work with a very small set of participants, simply translating bilinguals in each of these sites, translating the concepts into local equivalents. We did that in 2 ways. First, simply the isolated word, but then we had example sentences that were supplied in order to elicit different types of meaning of each of these words. And we also already in study 1A, we elicited example sentences about each of the words. The next, so the core of the study is 1B, which we're working on. That's the part we're working on now, which tried essentially to elicit 3 types of data. First, in the local language. So we're now eliminating English, and we're working with the set of key terms of each of the languages. I'll show briefly go over all of them shortly, and then get example sentences, get folk definitions, and then a free listing task of getting associated terms in each of the field sites. So the state of the art currently is here where we stand. A number of field sites have collected all of the data, but we also are still collecting the data in some of the field sites for B and C, and other, we'll see how far we can progress until the end of the year with the remaining languages. So back to this. So what I'm going to talk about today is essentially primarily trying to give a brief overview of the differences in uses of these key terms that were elicited in order to get to get a rough idea of the denotational extension of the terms. So what is the semantic range that these terms cover? So we've been coding these for essentially the following categories, and they are more fine-grained than some might think necessary, but the idea was to really get at the specifics of particular mental verbs in all of the languages. So so a number of these could also be thought of as either the same thing or like one encompassing the other. But so there should be some overlaps. But we were trying to do it first as fine-grained as possible, and then to see where we might need to actually refine further, or where we could summarize some of these categories together. So the first one is obviously propositional knowledge. So one of the examples is, I know that birds lay eggs, but that is not just, of course, not just knowledge, but I know, I understand, I believe, I think that, whatever. Which is distinct from procedural, which is sort of knowing how. I know how to catch fish. again, distinct from recognitional, do you know my brother? Which we've then also distinguished, we distinguish content, knowing a lot of story, knowing some sort of content, which we also then distinguish from topic. So the cognitive topic of I'm thinking about, or thinking of, or knowing of something. Knowing why, we separated that out. Interpersonal understanding, thank you for your understanding and some of these uses. And then linguistic, we also found it necessary to distinguish linguistic from communicative. There's actually some languages that have lexicalized these in different ways. Understanding English and understanding somebody as they're talking, so sort of an audible. And then, yeah, religious belief, that was of course targeted of the lexeme for whatever translates into belief, whether, although we have not just, I'm struggling sort of how to exactly term this, because it's not necessarily only religious. Like having faith in someone is essentially the same type of a meaning. And then for the adjective wise, it's pretty unique. And then also the nominal, we haven't really focused on the nominal uses, but wherever we could, wherever they would come up, we've been coding for that as for nominal uses of these as well. So here's some of the, so far what we've got in Spanish. There's of course one of the, which is very familiar to everybody, is the distinction between propositional or procedural and recognitional knowledge, which is common in Indo-European languages, but also in many, many others. English doesn't do it. The English, it's both covered by the verb know. And then the two seeming, what is interesting, the two seemingly equivalent understanding verbs, comprender and entender, which is native speakers do have difficulty distinguishing. So that you get a lot of circular explanations in our folk explanations, as one essentially being explained in terms of the other, and then vice versa. So so that's sort of the we can if you're interested, we can also then look at these in more detail. In Japanese, we have three verbs related to knowing and understanding: shiru, wakaru, and rikai, which overlap in many ways, but we didn't get evidence for that. So there was always one where propositional, procedural, and recognitional uses were missing for each of these. Now, I should mention that this is only the evidence that they might be possible to be used in these ways as well, but that's sort of the data that we got. So in all of the data that we have, and that's sort of what we're interested in. So we're not interested really in all the possible uses at this point, but really what comes to mind? What do people spontaneously come up with in usage? And we haven't quantified that yet, because the 1B part, where we do have an N that is where we do have enough power, most of that is still not coded. Essentially, like Spanish and Japanese are the ones where we're done with that, but for the other languages, that's still in progress. Mandarin, which we just completed a couple of weeks ago. There we've been focusing on three knowledge verbs: wen, xi, zidao, and liao jie. And only zidao here can take a preposition, and there's some literature on that as well that that discusses that. The interesting thing is that here the linguistic understanding seems to be lexicalized differently from interpersonal and communicative understanding, with li jie versus liao jie. Also worth perhaps looking into in more detail once we get all the rest of the data coded. Then Shiliad is interesting in that the same root neka is used for knowing, wisdom, and belief, which with respective different suffixes, but then it's distinct has a very distinct lexeme for understanding inindim, and which seems to be only reserved for understanding in the linguistic and interpersonal senses. Yeah. And then Arabic also distinguishes between knowing and understanding very clearly, expressed by different roots, with yarifu, and so the root part of that is, I'm not familiar at all with Arabic, but it's sort of the middle part, dif and however that is pronounced. And finally, then Afrikaans, derived from Dutch, also makes that classic distinction between propositional and recognitional knowledge. isiZulu, by contrast, uses more like English, the same root, wazi, for all kinds of knowing. And similarly to Mandarin, it also, the linguistic and community of understanding seem to be like differently with two different roots, respectively. So, yeah, so that's sort of where we're at. What are some of the implications? Of course, to linguists, this might seem trivial. Of course, we have different words. We have linguistic diversity, so obviously we would expect this kind of different mappings to be the results here. But what do we make of that for philosophy? So one answer is, of course, to try, which a lot of people have been done, is try to reduce the diversity to those elements which might indeed be shared across languages and cultures. Among the advocates for that approach is the NSM, Natural Semantic Meta-Language approach by Wierzbicka and Cliff Goddard, and there's been an ongoing, Steve knows probably most about that, an ongoing dialogue between the NSM and the epistemology, ethno-epistemology projects. But the question that always comes up there, so how would that sort of, this kind of reducing it to a universal, how would that be relevant for epistemology at large, but also specifically for what Stich and Mizumoto call this multicultural, multilinguistic epistemology. So, some of the interesting things that we've also found here is that some of these, actually what the NSM people say, that, well, these indispensable epistemological concepts, such as propositional, like the verb of knowing with a propositional complement, are not universal. So they say these are not semantic primes at all. Here, though, we do find that at least the languages that we surveyed so far all have some possibility of expressing a verb plus a complement plus propositional complement. However, the terms in and of themselves, of course, vary greatly, both in semantics and the grammatical constructions that they afford. So perhaps it's not so much the question of whether we can come up with a common universal common denominator for epistemology, and rather what can we use from these other uses. And that's sort of what I think we try to get at with that data. Using the variation and extension to expand the purview of epistemology that we're. So what other questions could we be asking? How may the range of ordinary uses of the variety of mental state verbs in the different languages help our understanding of what knowledge may be, even if we have to contend with mere family resemblances of knowledge or epistemology. So we do hope to advance further in that direction, and the core part of B and C is, of course, to study these spontaneous folk definitions and associations of the terms that come up in the data. And yeah, I invite you to stay tuned once we get through that. Thank you.